It was September 17th, 1944. A cold wind swept across the flat fields of the Netherlands. Dawn light shimmered on canals that ran like silver veins through the Dutch countryside. Somewhere above the morning haze, a thunderous hum began to roll in, the kind that made villagers stop mid-step and look skyward. They had heard German bombers before, but this sound was different, deeper, broader, and multiplied 100-fold. It was the sound of salvation. Hundreds of aircraft, C-47 Dakotas, gliders, and escorting P-51 Mustangs filled the skies. Operation Market Garden had begun. On the ground, Dutch civilians peered from cellar doors and shattered windows. Months of occupation had taught them to fear movement. The Gestapo's black cars, the sudden knock at night, the ration shortages, every part of life had been stripped of dignity. But that morning, the heavens rumbled with a sound they hadn't heard in years: American engines. Children pointed upward as parachutes bloomed open like white flowers over Eindhoven and Nijmegen. Some villagers crossed themselves. Others wept silently. At precisely 10 a.m., radio operators aboard the 101st Airborne crackled out coded words. "Drop zone able, go." The doors opened, and the sky erupted. Paratroopers hurled themselves into the air, their silhouettes slicing through beams of sunlight. Wind tore at their uniforms, tracer rounds zipped past. One by one, they drifted toward Dutch soil, men carrying everything from rifles and grenades to hope itself. Allied Airborne Operations Report, September 1944. When they landed, villagers didn't run. Instead, they sprinted toward the soldiers. An old woman kissed the dirt-stained hand of an American private who had just cut his chute. Farmers brought milk and bread from hidden cellars. One man lifted his little daughter so she could touch a paratrooper's patch, the Screaming Eagle. For the first time in 4 years, people dared to wave orange flags again. In the small town of Sun, a unit led by Captain John Cole set up a temporary radio relay in a burnout farmhouse. Their orders were clear: establish contact with British armor advancing north from Belgium. The problem? German jammers were flooding the airwaves. Static screamed through the headphones. Cole's radio operator, Sergeant Frank Dolan, crouched over the set, sweat running down his temple despite the chill. He adjusted frequencies, cursed softly, and tapped out test bursts in Morse. Nothing came back. He knew without that signal, coordination would collapse. Bridges would fall before Allied armor arrived. Signal Corps log, September 17th, 1944. Outside, artillery thundered. German units of the 59th Infantry Division had regrouped faster than expected, striking the airborne corridor from both flanks. Civilians hid in cellars as shells ripped through streets. Through the din, Dolan heard his lieutenant shout, "Get me London, now." He couldn't. The static was absolute. For a moment, fear froze him. Then he made a choice that would change the battle. Against direct orders not to use open civilian frequencies, he switched the dial to a Dutch commercial band. Across the river in Eindhoven, a hidden resistance group was still operating an old Philips radio, disguised beneath floorboards. When Dolan's voice crackled through their speaker, calling any Allied unit, "This is Able Fox 9, Sun Bridge under attack." The operator stared in disbelief. He grabbed his microphone, trembling. "This is Orange 1, Eindhoven Resistance. We copy you." That single forbidden exchange cut through the fog of war. Within minutes, the Resistance transmitted Dolan's message through an underground telephone line still connected to British Field HQ across the border. The response came back swift: "Hold the bridge. Armor en route." By dusk, American paratroopers lay behind shattered walls, rifles braced. The bridge at Sun shook under explosions, but it held. Civilians scurried through side alleys carrying ammunition boxes for the soldiers. One teenage boy, no older than 16, ran rounds to a machine gun nest until a mortar struck nearby. He survived, ears ringing, his shirt spattered with brick dust. Later he said, "They didn't treat us as cowards. They treated us as part of it." Eindhoven Resistance Archive. Meanwhile, the Germans counterattacked with armored half-tracks. Flames rolled through rooftops. Dolan kept his radio running, despite orders to conserve power. "Keep transmitting," Cole ordered. "If they jam one, switch again." He did. On a burst of static, the tankers of the Guards Armored Division finally heard his coordinates. Miles away, British Sherman tanks gunned their engines and charged north under the rising moon. By the time they reached Sun Bridge, the the scene resembled a nightmare. Houses burned in orange streaks along the canal. American medics moved between bodies, wrapping bandages with hands blackened by soot. Dutch civilians emerged from basements clutching candles, their faces lit by trembling light. When the British tanks rumbled across, the villagers erupted in tears. They cheered the Americans who had held the line long enough. But that victory came at a price. Dozens of paratroopers lay silent beside the bridge they'd saved. Dolan sat near the radio set, its casing dented by shrapnel. His headset hung around his neck, still humming faintly. He looked toward the villagers gathering bread and blankets for his wounded comrades. One woman, barefoot, knelt beside him and pressed a small wooden crucifix into his palm. "For freedom," she whispered. He didn't speak Dutch, but he understood. Across the fields, the faint rumble of Allied columns filled the night. Market Garden's gamble was only beginning, and while Sunbridge held, the road ahead stretched into a storm. German reinforcements were already on the move near Nijmegen and Arnhem. The radio operator who had disobeyed orders didn't yet know that his signal had saved an entire corridor from collapse. For now, he only knew the faces of civilians crying in the firelight, the sound of tank engines echoing through liberation's first hours. He watched the Dutch children chasing after departing jeeps, waving makeshift flags. Soldiers tossed them chocolate bars and cigarettes, tokens of a world beyond hunger and fear. Somewhere above, the sky glowed faintly from tracer fire and burning fuel. To the civilians below, it looked almost like dawn. As night settled, Dolan sat by the radio once more, whispering into the static. "Able Fox 9 is still holding." No answer came, but he smiled anyway. In that silence, every tear, every cheer, every breath of freedom the Dutch people took that day was his reply. Yet beyond the horizon, orders were shifting. Commanders were furious about his breach of protocol. Somewhere in the chain of command, an investigation had already been noted. Unauthorized civilian frequency use, to be reviewed. What Dolan didn't know was that same forbidden message would soon become the difference between triumph and catastrophe. The real test was coming, and the forbidden transmission was only the beginning. When dawn broke on September 18, 1944, the fields around Sunbridge were littered with twisted parachutes, empty cartridges, and the smell of cordite. The mist hung low, carrying the echo of tank engines from miles away. Sergeant Frank Dolan sat beside his battered SCR-300 radio, checking the dials with trembling hands. It was the first truly portable FM backpack transceiver ever fielded on such a scale, 27 pounds of steel, tubes, and copper that had changed the rhythm of battle itself. Signal Corps Technical Manual TM11 to 242, 1944. The SCR-300 had been the quiet marvel of American innovation. Developed by the Motorola Engineering Laboratory in Chicago, its designers, Donald Mitchell and Alfred Gross, had solved the greatest problem of infantry warfare: communication under fire. Using frequency modulation rather than the static-ridden AM of earlier sets, it offered clarity even amid artillery thunder. Its range, 2 to 3 miles through rough terrain, was short compared to the massive truck-mounted radios of headquarters units, but it allowed squads to talk instantly without wires, messengers, or guesswork. Motorola Archives, 1943. Dolan understood its limits and possibilities better than most. He had trained in England for weeks, learning to tune, repair, and even rewire the set under stress. He knew the glow of its vacuum tubes meant life. The moment they darkened, silence meant death. On that second morning in the Netherlands, the radio's battery indicator was nearly flat. Regulations forbade using civilian power, but Dolan remembered the farmhouse nearby that still had a generator. He stripped the wires, improvised a connection with his bayonet, and prayed. The tubes lit again, humming faintly, a sound as comforting as a heartbeat. Across the corridor, paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne were still fighting to secure the bridges at Grave and Nijmegen. Each crossing mattered. Every delay tightened the German noose. The entire Market Garden plan depended on a narrow road now known grimly as Hell's Highway. Commanders needed synchronization to the minute, armor moving up, infantry holding flanks, engineers clearing obstacles. Without radios like Dolan's, the massive operation risked unraveling before Arnhem. After Action Summary 101st Airborne, September 1944. German forces, too, were adapting fast. SS Panzer units from Kampfgruppe Harzer had intercepted Allied chatter, believing they could exploit the airborne isolation. But they were wrong. FM transmission's line-of-sight nature made interception nearly impossible. The Germans heard fragments of static, nothing more. Confused reports spoke of phantom coordination, units that moved with uncanny timing, appearing wherever they were least expected. Bundesarchiv Field Diary, September 19, 1944. By mid-morning, Dolan's set crackled to life with coded bursts. The British Guards Armored Division was approaching from the south. To prevent friendly fire, Dolan transmitted precise grid references, a risky act with jammers nearby. Bridge intact. Civilians aiding evacuation. Enemy armor on the east bank. His voice was calm, but every word carried the tension of hundreds of lives. In return, a clipped British accent broke through. Acknowledged, Able Fox 9. Hold for contact. It was the first secure two-way link between the airborne drop zones and advancing armor. Nearby, Captain Cole studied his map on the hood of a captured Kubelwagen. "This is how we stay alive," he muttered. Dolan nodded, still working the handset. The SCR-300's antenna gleamed wet in the drizzle. Engineers back home would have been proud to see their creation enduring Holland's mud and chaos. Many of those engineers were barely older than Dolan himself. Factory workers in Illinois soldering circuits through the night, while listening to war bulletins on the radio sets they had helped invent. War Production Board Report, 1944. In the afternoon, the Germans launched a coordinated counterattack from Best, 6 miles west. For Panzer IVs rolled along the dike road, their tracks grinding over the embankment. American bazooka teams waited in shallow ditches, nerves stretched thin. Dolan's task was to relay artillery fire requests to the 377th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion. The first shells fell wide. Adjustments came fast through his set. Shift 100 left, 50 short. Seconds later, explosions bracketed the lead tank. The third volley struck its ammunition rack, a flash of white-orange, metal hurling skyward. Civilians watching from barns cheered through tears. Inside a nearby command jeep, Cole scribbled a note for headquarters. FM radio coordination effective beyond expectation. That line would later appear almost word for word in division records. But for Dolan, it wasn't theory, it was survival. His headset buzzed constantly with overlapping voices, medics requesting morphine drops, engineers asking for demolitions, and scouts reporting sniper nests. Every few minutes, he switched frequencies to maintain clarity. It was a symphony of chaos turned into rhythm. As night descended, tracer lines stretched across the fields. The Dutch villagers who had helped carry ammunition now sheltered wounded men in their homes. Dolan moved between positions, repairing broken antenna rods with wire scavenged from a chicken coop. He met a boy who offered him a candle stub for light. Together they rewired a set that had fallen into mud. "You fix it, mister?" the boy asked. Dolan smiled faintly. "We'll fix everything, kid." Eindhoven Resistance Oral Collection. At 2100 hours, a new signal arrived. One Dolan almost dismissed as interference. It came faint, coded, and urgent. Nijmegen Bridge captured. Armor advancing to Arnhem. Hold current line. The message was proof that the corridor remained open. Dolan repeated it 3 times to confirm before logging it by hand. That paper, smeared with mud and candle wax, would later be displayed in a Dutch museum as the note that ensured Eindhoven's survival. The technical backbone behind that moment was remarkable. Each SCR-300 carried a pair of 2 A4 tubes, required an 18-volt dry battery, and operated on frequencies between 40 and 48 MHz, far beyond what German field radios could jam effectively. Range depended on terrain. In flat Dutch farmland, Dolan's set reached nearly 4 miles. It was more than engineering. It was trust in invisible waves, bouncing between courage and steel. Signal Corps Engineering Bulletin, 1944. By the second night, exhausted paratroopers held a thin perimeter along the canal. Ammunition ran low. The Germans began probing with mortars and machine gun fire. Dolan's radio suddenly went silent again, the battery dead at last. He stared at the lifeless dial, then at the flickering lamps of nearby houses. Against every standing order, he entered a cellar where a Dutch mechanic had hidden an old car engine. "Can you make this run?" Dolan asked. The man nodded. They stripped parts, rigged wires, and within minutes, sparks leapt across terminals. Power surged into the radio. It hummed once more. Somewhere above the static, British armor responded, reading U-5x5. Reinforcements inbound. That signal reached headquarters at exactly 3:12 a.m., recorded in the operations log as transmission received via improvised source. It was Dolan's second act of defiance, and the second that saved lives. Allied Signal Record Group 112. When the sun rose on September 19th, the bridge at Sun still stood. Dolan watched as convoys of Sherman tanks rolled north, their treads crushing empty cartridge belts into the mud. He had not slept in 48 hours, yet his hands never shook. Around him, civilians hung orange banners from windows despite sniper fire still echoing in the distance. To them, the Americans weren't just soldiers. They were proof that silence could be broken, that a single forbidden voice on the airwaves could summon an army. He looked at the radio one last time before dismantling it. The casing was dented, the paint scorched, but inside, it pulsed with faint warmth. Dolan whispered, "Good work, old man," as if the machine could hear. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang for the first time in years. Liberation was moving north, and the forbidden message that had once risked court-martial was now etched into victory itself. Yet the campaign was far from over. Arnhem waited, and disaster waited with it. The same radio waves that had saved the Sun Bridge would soon carry a plea no one could answer in time. The morning of September 20th brought a fragile calm to the Dutch lowlands. Smoke still clung to the thatched rooftops, mingling with the scent of wet earth and diesel. In the town square of Sun, American medics worked silently beside Dutch volunteers, carrying stretchers across cobblestones slick with rain and blood. Church bells tolled faintly in the distance, not for a service, but as an unspoken signal that the Germans had retreated for now. For the villagers, liberation had the texture of disbelief. They had lived 5 years under occupation, where every knock on a door carried dread. Now, they watched soldiers with strange accents distribute chocolate and canned peaches to children who hadn't tasted sugar since 1939. One woman collapsed to her knees as a medic handed her bread, clutching it to her chest like treasure. Tears streamed down her face. The medics didn't understand her words, but they understood the tone, a gratitude mixed with exhaustion, the kind born from surviving what should have killed the soul. American troops moved carefully through the town, their uniforms stiff with dried mud. Each man carried the weariness of days without rest, but morale had changed. Where there had been uncertainty, there was now conviction. They had seen what their presence meant. These people weren't abstractions on a map. They were faces pressed against shattered windows, waving fragments of orange fabric as if color itself had returned to life. Even the toughest paratroopers swallowed hard when elderly men hugged them in silence. The moment became a kind of mutual resurrection. The psychological shift ran deeper than emotion. For the first time, Allied command realized the immense power of morale transmitted through action, not speeches, not propaganda, but through the visible, human result of coordination and sacrifice. The Dutch resistance, previously fractured by fear, suddenly unified around the idea that victory was tangible. Within days, radio operators across liberated sectors began exchanging coded messages of hope. "The Americans are coming. Hold out a little longer." Each signal carried confidence the way Dolan's forbidden transmission had carried sound. Strategically, the events at Sun and Eindhoven reshaped communication doctrine across the Western Front. Field commanders requested thousands more FM sets. Factories in Chicago and Newark ran night shifts, with women soldering circuits under posters reading "Your hands, his lifeline." In 1 week, the Signal Corps distributed more than 8,000 new radios. What had started as a daring experiment in portable coordination became the backbone of Allied command flexibility. Every squad could now be its own node of intelligence. The war was turning from an era of command chains to an era of information webs. Meanwhile, German after-action summaries revealed confusion bordering on disbelief. Officers reported Allied movements that seemed telepathic. Their own field radios, limited to shortwave AM, crackled with static every time rain fell. They failed to grasp that American FM signals, bouncing cleanly off terrain, allowed near-instant updates. This advantage wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. An enemy who never knew where you'd strike next began to imagine strength greater than reality. Fear became a multiplier. Behind every frontline success stood an army of invisible contributors. The engineers who designed waterproof casings for radios, the metallurgists who refined copper alloys, and the factory clerks tracking shipment codes in pencil on paper. In a war celebrated for tanks and aircraft, it was the unseen world of circuits and frequencies that kept those machines aligned toward the same purpose. When General Eisenhower later wrote that communications won the campaign as surely as firepower, he was echoing what thousands of anonymous workers already knew. The battle for Europe was as much about electrons as it was about bullets. Back in Sun, Dolan's unit received orders to push north. Before departing, they gathered in the square where townspeople had laid flowers atop an overturned German half-track. A Dutch priest recited a brief prayer for the dead, in Latin, because language barriers made little difference. When he finished, a child stepped forward holding a small wooden cross fashioned from radio antenna wire. He handed it to Dolan without a word. The sergeant tucked it into his jacket pocket and walked away, boots echoing softly on stone. As Market Garden stretched toward Arnhem, the optimism of those days met the harsh calculus of war. The corridor would soon collapse under relentless counterattacks. Dolan's transmissions could not alter that grand failure. Yet historians would later note that the rescue of the Dutch civilians in Sun became the emotional anchor of the entire operation. It proved that even partial victories mattered, each one a fragment of humanity reclaimed from chaos. Psychologists studying troop morale found measurable boosts in performance after interactions with liberated civilians. Men fought harder when they had seen what freedom looked like. Post-war assessments confirmed the enduring influence of that episode. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey included a surprising conclusion. The decisive factor in sustained Allied performance was not air power alone, but the perception among troops that their actions directly liberated people rather than simply destroyed enemies. The Dutch gratitude transformed abstract duty into moral momentum. Generals could measure ammunition. They couldn't measure the strength that comes from a civilian's embrace. In the decades that followed, those lessons evolved into doctrine. During the Cold War, NATO communication strategies explicitly cited rapid, decentralized coordination as the Sun model. By Vietnam, every platoon radioed through FM networks descended from the SCR-300's design. In Desert Storm, American forces synchronized tanks, aircraft, and infantry through digital signals, the modern echo of Dolan's forbidden message. Even today, when satellites replace field antennas, the philosophy remains. Connectivity saves lives. Information is armor. For the Dutch who lived through that week in 1944, memory never dimmed. In the town museum, Dolan's mud-stained transmission log still rests behind glass. Beside it hangs a faded photograph of villagers embracing soldiers beside the Sun Bridge. The caption reads simply, "When they spoke, we were free." Each year on the anniversary, school children lay tulips there, their petals the same orange as the banners once waved from those bullet-scarred windows. The story spread far beyond the Netherlands. American veterans returning home carried photographs of smiling Dutch families, and newspapers printed letters of thanks from Eindhoven. For a nation weary of war rationing and telegrams marked "killed in action," these images offered something priceless, proof that sacrifice had meaning. Parents who had buried sons could imagine them as saviors of strangers, not just victims of strategy. That sentiment fortified the home front for the final push into Germany. As for Sergeant Dolan, little is recorded after 1945. He declined medals, returned to Illinois, and worked as a radio repairman. Neighbors said he spent evenings on his porch tinkering with old transmitters, tuning through the static as though listening for voices long gone. When asked once about the war, he reportedly smiled and said, "All I did was call for help." But the Dutch remembered differently. To them, he was the man who turned forbidden airwaves into deliverance. The bridge at Sun still stands. Modern cars pass where tanks once rumbled, unaware that beneath the asphalt lies the soil where a single radio pulse decided a town's fate. Each stone bears silent witness to that improbable link, one man, one message, and a chain of events that stretched across continents. It reminds every visitor that wars are not won solely by orders obeyed, but sometimes by the courage to disobey them. In the end, that is the legacy of the forbidden message, that clarity amid chaos can change history, and that compassion, transmitted across fear and static, carries farther than any bullet ever could.